Okay, I'm Linda Jackson. I'm interviewing Alex Hodge on the 16th of July 2014. So Alex, if you could start by giving me your full name and place and date of birth.
My full name?
Yeah.
Yes, it's Alex Hodge. Well, Alexander Edward Hodge is my full name, and my place and date of birth is the 24th of September 1979 at Billinge Hospital.
And we're here today to talk about some of your ancestors that served in the First World War. So could you start by telling me about anyone you know in your family who actually served in the military in the First World War?
It was my great-granddad, John Wainwright.
Okay. And do you know their date and place of birth, his date and place of birth?
Yes, he was born on the 23rd of October 1894 at Orrell Gardens in Wigan, which I think it's the site of the Orrell Library.
And can you tell me anything about their family history? Do you know anything about who
Well,
they
I
were?
know that his father was born in Staffordshire and moved to Wigan in about sort of 1880, 1870, I'm not quite sure of the date, because his sister was working in Pemberton as a teacher. And so he moved here, got married my great-great-grandmother who worked in the mill, and then they sort of settled in Orrell at the time, and he went to work at Worsley Mains Colliery as a colliery wave clerk. And his mother never went to work again after having children. He had one brother and three sisters. One unfortunately died quite young.
Okay, thank you. And so do you know when your great-grandfather enlisted?
Well, he joined the Territorial Army for the 5th Battalion, the Manchester Regiment, on the 11th of February 1913, and so he was called back in 1914, the outbreak of war, to the drill hall in Wigan, and they were offered £5 to those that wanted to volunteer to go off to war. So it would have been 1914.
Okay, and do you know where he then served?
Yes, he served initially with the 5th Battalion Manchester Regiment in Gallipoli. Well, he went off initially to Alexandria, and then they went over to Gallipoli in 1915, and then he moved from Gallipoli. He was invalided out later on in 1915 in November because he was suffering from jaundice and dysentery quite severely. So he came home, and on the way back he saw in the ship that he was coming back on Lord Kitchener, and he said that he just looked like his poster with his huge moustache. And then he came back and went to a convalescent home in Essex for a short time. And then he was given a new role of escorting troops, new recruited troops, about sort of early 1916 from the Wigan Recruiting Office to Ashton-under-Lyne, because this was the first time when conscription was brought in. And in April 1916 he was posted to a battalion of the Manchester Regiment in Southport, but he hated that because they were all treated as new recruits, because at the time he moved his way up from private when he initially joined to corporal, and then company quartermaster sergeant for the 5th Battalion of the company that he was in. So he hated sort of being treated as a new recruit and told how to use a rifle and things like that. So he saw an advert to join the Machine Gun Corps, which him and three other non-commissioned officers and himself went off and applied, and then he joined the Machine Gun Corps, and he moved to France in March 1917, again as company quartermaster sergeant, and his role was to sort of organise billets for the soldiers, and he had to use his schoolboy French to go off and find billets for people, and he issued the rum ration out to people, and one story that was that he gave one of the soldiers the rum ration then to take off to the front, and on the way that this soldier drank the rum ration, and he was convicted, and my great-granddad witnessed something called the Field Punishment No. 1, which was quite rarely given out because the commander of his particular company was quite a disciplinarian, and that was involved being tied to a machine gun carriage wheel. So it was quite barbaric, and even though nobody liked it, it was just what, unfortunately, this person had been convicted of that, and there's nothing they could have done about it. And then before the Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele, he was commissioned. He was recommended for commission as an officer to the Tank Corps, which was associated with the Machine Gun Corps. And so he didn't actually fight the Battle of Passchendaele. He left to go to officer training back in Britain, and he learned to use a tank and was issued with a chainmail visor over his eyes, which used to scare my mother in the 1950s when they brought it out to display. And then so he was then commissioned as second lieutenant into the 8th Battalion of the Tank Corps in 1918, and he's had a role of a Mark IV, one of the early tanks, as a tank commander. And when the armistice was declared in 1918, he was actually on a course to learn to become a tank instructor, to teach people how to ride the tanks. And then so that course immediately finished, and he went back to the 8th Battalion, but he didn't actually leave the army till 1919. Initially he was posted to the 13th Battalion of the Tank Corps in the Army of the Occupation of the Rhine, around Cologne, and then he was a demobilisation officer. So just before he was demobilised in November 1919, he was promoted to lieutenant.
That's a really interesting war career, isn't it? He was all over the place.
He didn't suffer any major issues. He had a problem with rheumatism or arthritis in his knee, and he had stomach difficulties right to the time that he died, because of all the dysentery that he suffered from. Because he said lots of people did suffer from dysentery, unfortunately, but generally he didn't go to the doctor till the person said that he looked a funny colour with the jaundice. Then he went and was then immediately invalided home, and he wouldn't have normally been invalided right back to Britain, but this was the end of the Gallipoli campaign, so it was the time then the Manchester Regiment wouldn't have moved on to France if he'd stayed with them. And
do you know anything else about his time in Gallipoli? Have you got any stories about that?
Well, I know that because he was a company quartermaster sergeant, his job was to issue out the rum ration and the lime ration, and before that they used to make rum punch with the ration of the rum. The 5th Battalion, it was a territorial army battalion, and when they were posted out, they were trained as signallers. So when he was in the army before the war, he went to learn to do semaphore training at Hay Country Park and all sorts of things like Morse code and things like that. So his role in Gallipoli was to provide that signal role, and one of his roles was to go out and lay telephone lines, and he was involved in digging a new trench nearer to the Turkish line prior to the attack on the 4th of June, because they had a number of attacks, one of the attacks on the 4th of June 1915, and so he had to go out into no man's land, and when he came back he found he'd not taken his rifle with him, so I had a bit of a ticking off from the senior officers there that he'd gone out taking all the stuff with him. And he also had this role as a signaller to advance in the second wave to the old Turkish front, and establish and maintain a telephone link with the battalion HQ that was behind the lines. And he was also involved in training troops, and we found out that some of the troops were very badly trained because they'd never been shown how to fire a rifle, so he took them to an old gully and behind the lines to show them how to use this rifle. So and then from August 1915, like I said, he went from corporal initially when they got to Alexandria, then to platoon sergeant, and then in August 1915 to company quartermaster sergeant, which involved, as I said before, issuing out rum ration, other administrative duties, charge of food, stores, uniforms, and he spent his 21st birthday in Gallipoli when it rained all day, he said.
And do you know, because that must have been a massive culture shock going from kind of the Wigan area to Gallipoli and Alexandria. Has he left any memories of that, of what it was like?
Well, he said when he first initially landed, he said in his sort of memoirs, he took it in his stride really, and it was the first time he was ever out of this country at all. He just said it was when they landed by the docks, there was lots of fruit, and one thing that he did say was part of in Gallipoli, it was just lots of flies were about, and unfortunately because of the dead bodies, there was loads of flies getting in the food. You couldn't get away from the flies at all, and that put him off the apricots for the rest of his life, because they must have got served apricot jam, because it just seemed that they had quite a basic food. They were issued food and cooked it themselves, but it was a lot of bully beef, corned beef as we call it now, and ate a lot of that, and bread and jam, but it was just mainly, when on the front line it was flies, because he talks of going into one of the trenches and there was a hand sticking out, because they just used to bury people where they lay at that time.
Sounds horrific.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what.
No, I wouldn't like to go through it whatsoever.
And to go back to his experience in the tank, was it the tank corps?
Yes.
Again, I guess that's quite early on for tanks, isn't
Yes.
it? Must have been one
early.
of the first men to have that role, and particularly with training other people in it. Did he say anything about that experience?
Just that he went out with. They were stationed with various infantry battalions, so their role was to support the infantry to go off and do sorties and things like that. He didn't actually get involved in any sort of major battles. It was more to sort of go out into the field, and this is why they were issued with these chainmail mesh, because the idea was if a rifle or something else hit the tank and lots of sparks, it would have protected his eyes. But he seems to have sort of taken and accustomed to that, to being a commander of a tank, with the idea of making him an instructor, because as I said before, he was quite lucky in his army career. He sort of seemed to be at the right place at the right time without actually getting into any serious incidents and anything like that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. That you've got.
Yes, I mean there's a few here before he was actually in the war. He was a Piro before the war, him and his brother, and he was also in the Scouts in Newtown. I think it was in St Mark's. So he was involved in sort of scouting as well as being in the Territorial Army before the actual outbreak of the war. So there's a picture here of the 5th Battalion, the Territorial Battalion before the war. They're doing sort of various exercises, because they actually report to the drill hall every week in Wigan to do drill and sort of various exercises and go on camp. I think they went to Wales a few times to do various exercises, and Rivington as well. They went to as well to do exercises. And then if I turn over, there's a picture of him reclining. I think it's on that side. Reclining actually when they got to Egypt, in one of the first early camps that were based there, because their role in Egypt was to relieve the army that was actually based there. Presumably the Manchester Regiment that was there had to go off to France. They were brought in to sort of manage that local area. And then underneath that we've got three pictures of him at Gallipoli, which are quite faint really. And then underneath that we've got a picture of when he was actually back in Britain before he joined the Machine Gun Corps, once he'd been invalided back home. This was actually in Heaton Park in Manchester, as well as going to Southport. He was there at the time as well, and that's when he was in his uniform as a quartermaster sergeant. And then again here there's a picture of him when he was in age 21 in 1916 as company quartermaster sergeant in the Manchester Regiment. And here is one of his good friends, Sergeant Major Gilbert Tolley, who was also in the 5th Manchester Battalion. And then there's a picture here of when he was actually second lieutenant in the tank corps. So you can see sort of a change in uniform and hairstyle as well. He's moved from a non-commissioned officer to a commissioned officer, and like the way that the hair sort of was in that sort of respect, and then it was
he's a bit dappling there,
yeah.
isn't he? Yeah.
And the uniform quality, you can tell from just looking at it, it's sort of a better quality. And then there's another picture of him in France in 1919 after the end of the war, before he was demobilised back home.
So do you know what he actually did after the war then, when he came back?
Yes. I've got some photographs as well, which I can finish off showing these photographs, and then I can go in what he did actually after the war, because there's some photographs that are associated with that. There's pictures here when he was in the cadet school, actually training to become a second lieutenant back in Britain. So there's a sort of formal one with all their caps on, and a more informal one when they were smiling there, and then there's a picture.
So, sorry, which one is he in here then?
It's hard to see upside down.
So that one.
Yes, I think it was that one. Yes. There. And picture of a tank that he was presumably in, and then more pictures here of when he was in the tank corps. And it says here that this is a picture of his Batman.
Of his Batman? Batman.
Yeah, because each officer,
right.
each commissioned officer, or anyone, I think higher than probably a second lieutenant or a lieutenant, I'm not quite sure which, would have been associated with their own personal servant known as a Batman. And this was only phased out in the, I think, 1960s in the British Army, probably because of reduction in numbers. So I don't know, he never spoke, or there's no sort of notes about this person. He seemed to sort of take to being commissioned officer, I think, quite easily. There was they had to sort of go off to mess dinners and things like that, and we issued was they had to get mess kit and things like that. And then after the war, he came back to Britain, and it was sort of, he was thinking about what to do, and he thought about maybe going down to do a business venture with another army colleague in London. I'm not quite sure what the venture was, but he realised his heart was back in Lancashire, so he wanted to return back to Wigan. And he went back down the mine again, because I should have said before that he left school when he was about 12. He was extremely bright, it appears. He was top in his class. They did things in those days. And then he left school and then went to work as a clerk in an office doing a sort of debtor, but he hated it. And his father and other people managed to get him a job down at Worth Remains Colliery when he was 14, and it seemed like they were sort of working him as an apprentice because they could see that he wanted to go into colliery management. So he was sort of working towards that in his career. Before he left, he'd taken his deputy colliery manager's certificate, even though he couldn't actually work as a deputy colliery manager until I think he was 21, but then the war intervened. So when he came back to Britain, he went back down the mine just as a normal miner, and which must have been a bit of a strange thing from being an officer to working down the mine. And then luckily we got a government grant to go to the technical college here in Wigan, running a technical college, to do a 3-year diploma in mining. And then when that came to an end, he did his full colliery manager's certificate, and then he went to work as a junior official at Worth Remains Colliery, and then became colliery manager at Leyland Green Colliery, I think near Ashton. And that was from 1923 to 1927, during the time of the strike in 1926. And then the mine closed down after that. And then he was looking at other things to do. There was talk about him moving to South Wales, but he had a young family at the time. So him and his father-in-law and I think 2 other former officials in the mine decided to open up their own mine and put their own money together to open a mine in Billinge, at Billinge Lane Colliery. It was a drift mine and a deep shaft. So he carried on with that until the mine closed in the early 1950s. But in the meantime, they set up a haulage business, and there's some pictures here of the sort of... that was the Winstanley Collieries that he was working at, that was only owned Leyland Green. And then some more, there's pictures here of the haulage company, Billinge Lane, because he was managing director of the mine. It was a small mine, so they were licensed. I think they could only have a number of about 30 miners to actually work down there. And then I think that's the last picture. It's sort of.
That's a fascinating story to work his way up, isn't it? From
Yeah.
going down the pit.
Yeah, there's a number of the workers in 1954 when the mine closed, because unfortunately there was open cast mining. Because before the war, of course, everything was privatised, but things had conglomerated together. Just before, probably from the 30s onwards, to sort of because some of the prices of coal were quite low. I think it was 14 shillings per tonne of coal, which wasn't very much really. And so after the war, with the onset of the Labour government and nationalisation, they managed to persuade the government that small mines should stay in private hands. So they were licensed, small mines, to have 30 miners. So because Billings Lane was a sort of small mine, it was part of this non-nationalised company. And he went off to York in 1946 with other small mine associations and owners of small mines, and then they set up ultimately the Federation of Small Mines of Great Britain. And he, after a few weeks, I think, became chairman, and he stayed chairman, and I think he ended up as secretary or chairman, I can't remember which, until 1985, when he was in his early 90s. So he went off to work. He only retired properly from mining then, because after the Billings Lane Colliery closed because of open casting, they were open casting at the top, and it was sort of causing problems to the mine underneath and all the workings, and it caused him to get an ulcer at the time. It was just so stressful. He then became colliery manager and consultant of Windy Harbour Colliery in Winstanley, and then finished there till the mine closed, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s. But he carried on with the Federation work. It was sort of, they used to meet with the National Union of Miners, the Coal Board, ministers, to sort of look at how small mines could sort of work effectively, and how it sort of linked with other things within the Coal Board, within the nationalised structure. So like I said, I used to go to King Street nearly every day until I was a small boy in the mid-80s. I remember hearing that he'd retired, and it must have been about 5 or 6 when he sort of finally finished working.
It's a 70-year career.
Yeah, I think it was
really?
75 years in mining from beginning to end.
It's a long time, isn't it? Must have seen a lot of changes in with nationalisation.
Yeah,
but
we've got silver solvers at home that he was presented to over the years in his time in the Federation, and the archives here in Wigan have got his papers from that.
What a brilliant story.
Yeah,
oh,
so he was sort of involved in lots of mine-related issues from the time that he came out of the army to sort of not long before he died, really.
Did he say anything about the general strike?
Well, he said that he had a role to do, and the people that had gone on strike knew that they had a role to do, because there was only a few people actually working at the mine just to sort of stop water getting into the mine and keep it pumped out and things like that. So it was generally, they knew at times, unfortunately, there was lots of militant activity in the Wigan area. So there was a call once that they thought people were going to come from Pemberton to Leyland Green, the mob, as he called it in his memoirs, but that didn't actually happen at the time. So, but I think, unfortunately, because of the strike, that was one of the issues that made the mine and other mines close in 1927, because must have caused, even though they were pumping out water, they probably couldn't do as much as they could have done, because it was on for 6 months. So it must have caused a lot of issues on the sort of structure of the mine side.
Oh, it's really, really interesting. And you've got a couple of objects as well to show us.
Yes, I've got some bullets there that are from Gallipoli. I'm not quite sure if he brought them back from when he left his time at Gallipoli, or whether he bought those because he did go out after the war to sort of with other former comrades to visit Gallipoli. It was actually
for anniversaries and things. Or?
I've got a photograph as well, which I'll just move this out of the way. The day before he died, he went down for the 75th commemoration of Anzac Day, which was April 1990. Had a commemoration service in Westminster Abbey, and he went to the cenotaph. He's a picture of him there with my great uncle, and another one of him there as well in the wheelchair, and they got to meet the Queen Mother. But then unfortunately you couldn't tell any other family members apart from my great uncle and his family that lived nearer to London, because unfortunately he died of a brain aneurysm the next day.
That's sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
After all that time.
Yeah.
At least he was obviously active, right?
Yeah.
Right into the very end.
Yes, he used to walk up Billinge Hill.
Oh, did
He lived in Billinge from the 20s onwards, and used to go up Billinge Hill, I think, every day until nearly before he died. So he was very active. And then I've got as well, supposedly this was taken, supposedly the 5th Battalion were issued with bicycles when they first got to Egypt at the time of the rolling the signal. So this is a bicycle repair kit. And but there's also recollections of him cycling all the way from Wigan to Littleborough near Rochdale before they went off to France in 1914 when war had just been declared, and it's been the longest cycle ride he said he'd ever taken. That was with a rally bike, and so either that's from the time when he was cycling to Littleborough, or actually from the time in the in Egypt. But he didn't drink before then, and on the way to Littleborough it was the first time that he'd ever had an alcoholic drink.
You'd need it, so
Yes,
that way, wouldn't you?
yes, but I think he
Like
must have got a
refreshment.
taste of rum during his time, or the rum ration that they used to have every day.
And you've got some other pictures. Are those related
Oh, yes.
to your great?
I'll show you this one as well. This is a picture of my great-granddad in 1923, and he got married to my great-grandmother, Gwyneth Mary Ritson, and that's in his uniform of the tank corps, because even though he'd decided he didn't want to stay in the army, he was still, of course, allowed, being a lieutenant when he was decommissioned, to wear his uniform when he got married in 1923 in Wigan. And then
the picture.
I've got as well, I'll just open this up. This is the Wigan Observer from 1990, with information about his death. So it's just explaining about very briefly, his time in the army and then what he did after the army. And it says here that he was left, because my great-grandmother was still alive, left a wife, 2 sons, 1 daughter, 7 grandchildren and 10 great-grandchildren. And he's buried in St Aidan's in Billinge. And then my great-grandmother,
Can you give us her full name as well?
her was Mary Wainwright. I don't know if she had a middle name, and she was a nurse in the voluntary aided, I can't remember what the aided stands for.
Detachment.
Oh yes, voluntary aided detachment, and so she must have joined that during the war. And this is oral in 1916, being inspected. So I don't really know anything really about what she did, apart from she was there in this photograph. I know when my mother was little, she always dressed in black and never got out of bed because she said she had problems with her knees. So my mother sort of remembers this lady wearing black. Physically, I don't think she left her bed for years.
No. Did she have, presumably her uniform and things have been long lost now?
Yes, I don't know what happened. I mean, I don't really know much about her, really. I mean, I know a lot about my great-granddad because of his recollections. It was provided to a historian before he died. Lots of material that we subsequently gave to various museums and Tameside Archive, which is the archive of the Manchester Regiment. So one thing that we did give was a Bible that a lady gave to him in Bristol. A stranger just came up to him and gave him a Bible just before he left to go to Egypt.
Right.
And he carried that all through his time in the army.
That's a nice story,
Yes.
isn't it? And then came back safe. And do you know anything about your great grandmother? What she did during the war?
Well, she was
married.
Well, she only got married in 23.
Yeah.
So she moved up to Wigan in 1914 because they lived in South Wales. My great granddad, her father, was also a colliery manager, and he moved to Yorkshire, where he met my great grandmother, and then they got married. She was a school teacher, and they moved around. They came to Wigan. He was at Pemberton Colliery at one time, went off to South Wales, where he was a colliery manager there, and then he moved up to Wigan in 1914. And so the family story goes that when she moved up here, because she had a Welsh accent, she went to school at Up Holland Grammar School, which is now ultimately became Winstanley College, and they thought she was German because of her accent. So her war, I mean, she left school I think at 16. She went to work at a shop in Wigan, and then she suffered from the influenza and nearly died in 1918 when the big influenza outbreak, and her eyesight suffered from that, and she had to wear glasses for the rest of her life. And so her wartime experience was just as a member of a civilian, as being a civilian and as a schoolgirl.
I did have one more question. I was just going to ask you how you feel about your family's experiences of the First World War. Is there anything that, do you feel particularly proud, or is it's obviously something that's quite important?
Oh yeah, it's very important to me his time in the First World War, because especially because he went from the Territorial Army as a private and then worked his way up ultimately to become a lieutenant. They must have seen that he had great strength, because he was, as I said before, moved from a corporal to a platoon sergeant, and an administrative role as a company quartermaster sergeant, and then his role, as he would have carried on if the war had carried on, to become an inspector of tanks. So he just seemed to have a good war, if you could say that, but it must have affected him. And he never spoke about it to anybody in the family, to my knowledge, until before he died, when somebody came to talk to him, ultimately from the Imperial War Museum. So it's only that sort of information that we had, because when I was little, I remember it very vividly. He died when I was about 10, and he used to tell me stories of when he was a child, but nothing about the war. So I'm very proud of his exploits, but I don't think it's something that I could have done with all the stories of dead bodies and flies. And he used to recollect about patching up people who's been shot in the face and the arm, and these stories of dead bodies around trenches and things like that. So I do have two other quick things that he used to wear. Is this uniform, his tank corps uniform, to garden in after the war, and by the 50s I was told his trousers fell to bits, and then he hung it up in the garage at his house in Billinge. And so when he died, my great aunt inherited the house. She then brought in the uniform, and when I was about 18, first time that I'd actually seen it. And also we had some quite rare piece of army kit, a sleeping bag that we took to the National Army Museum a number of years ago, and they said it's very rare, and they used to use that as a mattress cover.
Right, yeah, I've never seen.
No,
I've never seen one.
No, it was as long as a mattress is, and it was covered sort of with the name of, I think it must have been, I can't remember if it was a tank corps, but it had sort of the name of it, and it was sort of big enough to be a mattress cover and under blanket, as it would have been at the time before duvets. And so I should have said as well, after the war he was also became a councillor in Billinge, and because of that he was awarded the CBE in the 1960s. I don't know, I might have a photograph of him going to get the...
And was he a Labour
CBE.
councillor then?
No, he was Conservative.
Was he?
Yes,
Right.
it was a very strong Conservative family. my granddad on the other side was Labour, but all the other members were Conservative as well on my dad's side. So yes, my great granddad was a Conservative councillor. I don't know if I got the photographs. Might be. There's all sorts of other family members here, but that was the house where my great grandmother was when she was in Wales, called Tydraw, which is in South Wales, before they moved up.
That's very fancy.
Yes, it was. We used to have nurse and outdoor indoor servants. There he is.
That's him getting his CD.
Yeah, outside of Buckingham Palace. Not like now when they wear top hats and things. He did have a top hat because I got it now. I inherited that, and his bowler hat I've got as well. So.
And do you still have his medal then?
The
award, or?
The CBE was inherited by my great uncle, the gentleman that took him to the commemoration of the Anzac Day. But my uncle, my mum's brother, has got the miniatures because the medals that he got during the war were, I think, just the normal 14-18 star. I don't think he wasn't issued with any bravery medals, to the best of my knowledge. It was just a sort of the medals that other people would have been given, who would have served at the same time. So.
Oh, what a fabulous story. That's a nice recognition of his work, isn't it?
When I was little, I asked to see, because I'd heard about the CB, I didn't know what it was, and he just got out the miniature. I remember looking at this miniature thing as well, and also he brought back from the war that my great uncle and another uncle have got now, with some shell cases that were decorated, because he used to do a lot of decoration of shell cases. So,
yeah, we've got some trench art. The trench art in the collection.
I don't know where he got them from. I don't know who did it, but it was one of the things that was around the house. That I mean, it's like these here. Me and my brother loved looking at them when we were little. We used to go and visit them, and there's nothing in them. They're inert, but it was just they look so interesting being there on the shelf. And I got them in a glass cabinet that belonged to them.
That's lovely. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.